Hello, and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Today I'll be talking to Susan Raich, who's a PhD student in the Faculty of History, and we're going to be talking about her PhD dissertation on maritime culture in the anglo-norman realm. So Susan, if you'd like to give us a brief introduction to your topic.
Yes, thank you. So first I should explain what I mean by the Anglo-Norman realm. So by that I refer to England and Normandy in the 11th and 12th centuries, and they can be called a realm because, as you may know, in 1066, Duke William of Normandy launched a fleet and conquered the Kingdom of England. So thereafter, until 1204, with a couple periods of exception, the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy were ruled jointly. So this required the king to travel back and forth across the channel to look to business on either side, and along with him, the court and followers came with him on board the ships. Also, nobles and aristocrats and religious houses came to hold lands on both sides of the channel, so we have the exchange of goods and personnel back and forth. So that's the kind of area I'm studying. And then why study maritime culture within it? Well, aside from these political reasons for traveling by sea, people were also traveling from England to the continent on pilgrimage or other business, and they were fishing. The herring fishery provided a staple component of the medieval diet and a big part of the economy of coastal dwellers. Also, we have trade going on between England and Normandy, but also further abroad with the Low Countries and Scandinavia, and then connecting on to the Mediterranean as well. So this Anglo-Norman world is bustling with maritime activity. And then there are larger historical developments going on at sea as well. So during this period, the carrying capacity of ships expanded about fivefold, it seems, from the shallower drafted Viking vessels that were good for quick beach landings. They were expanded to have broader sides and also much higher sides. So this gave greater room for bulk cargo holds. So there's an increasing volume of shipping traffic. And this is also evident in the development of port towns, especially around the North Sea and in the Mediterranean as well, that existing port towns are built up with more and more dock sites and quaysides to facilitate the loading and unloading of ships, and new port towns are also established. And so this gave rise to kind of an increasing trade around the North Sea. So that's what maritime historians can tell us, and overall this gives just kind of a small window then into the larger maritime history between the Vikings and the Age of Exploration. So by looking also at the Anglo-Norman realm, we can see how this world of seafaring impacted their daily lives.
I think it's interesting. It probably comes as a surprise to some people who know a lot less about the period that, England is so much more connected to a wider world, and that the sea is so vital in how they think of themselves, how they think of the world beyond. I was going to ask, before we move on, could you maybe unpack for us a little bit the term maritime culture and what kind of the components of that would be for you?
Yes, well, so I take it very broadly defined, how living by the sea or seafaring impacted people in their daily lives, and also how what we think of as Anglo-Norman culture transferred to a watery locale. So often the sea is seen as a separate place from the land, but actually I would argue that chivalry is happening on ships, and nautical skill is something that is very highly prized and valued in Anglo-Norman society. So it's kind of claiming the sea as part of this larger world.
It's really fascinating, expanding the way we think about it. I suppose I'd like to get down a little bit to the kind of the greasy details of it as well. I mean, what can you tell us about the experience of seafaring in this period?
Yeah, so, well, I should say, so ships were very technologically advanced at this time, but especially in the North Sea, where, well, as we know, living in England, we're subject to sudden shifts in the weather. This affects sailing as well. So someone might go out at sea and then a storm suddenly comes up and maybe there's nothing they can do. So seafaring was also a very risky business and rather fear-inducing for a lot of people. So they're very technically advanced and able to counter a lot of scenarios that might come up. But ultimately, the final recourse in times of trouble was to pray to God via many saints. So we hear a lot of stories about ships in danger at sea that are only saved through the intervention of a patron saint. And this is where the records were preserved at the saints' shrines, that then this gives evidence of this particular saint's powers of intervention. So I could share one story that kind of illustrates this shipping traffic in the realm and also the powers of saints. So there's one, I think I have it written down, there's a certain knight, and he's traveling from England to Normandy. Yes. So the background is this comes from the monastery of Bury St. Edmunds, and its abbot Baldwin was the personal physician of Kings Edward the Confessor and William the Conqueror. So at one point he was attending upon King William in Normandy and realized that he wanted a certain relic of St. Edmund back in Suffolk, back at Bury St. Edmunds. So he sends his messenger knight, named Norman, incidentally, back to Suffolk to fetch it. He does so, and he's trying to come back again to Normandy with the relic, and arrives at port in England. We don't know exactly which one. But he, this is where his nautical adventures begin. So I have a quote here. The aforementioned knight hastened to the sea as quickly as he could, but, finding that there weren't many ships, he was scarcely permitted to enter one with his horse when he paid the fare. And there were in that ship nearly 60 men, as well as 36 animals in number, and besides 16 horses with the heavy loads of merchants. And the ship, however much it was able to carry so many things, was barely able to be steadfast against the rising storms of the ocean. So here we see this world in play that there's a high demand for ships, and they can carry quite a lot, all these animals, but they're also kind of overloaded, and there's a very high demand. But the story doesn't end there, so sure enough, a storm came upon this ship, and all the passengers were panicking and throwing overboard their merchandise and even the livestock in order to lighten the load against the rising waves. They seem to have done this a lot. But because the knight Norman had the relics of the martyr Edmund, he was protected. He was able to keep his own horse, and also the storm made it into port safely, into the port of Barfleur. So here it was the Saint Edmund protecting them.
Not only protecting some of the animals.
Yes, well, and incidentally, we learn through this that we think of knights on horseback as typical kind of medieval characters, and they actually took these knights with them, and that allowed them to carry out business very quickly.
With your own horse.
Yes, yeah. And we learned from documentary sources as well that special gangplanks were installed in port towns specifically for loading horses into ships. So this happened in the major ports of the area, so Southampton and Dover and probably Barfleur where this knight landed. It
sounds very familiar to anyone who's taken a transatlantic ferry or a cross-channel ferry.
Indeed, they were like taking your car on the ferry.
Yeah, exactly, as in the early days. That's fascinating. I suppose that gives a real insight into the real physical conditions on board the ship as well. And you see this kind of animals, humans, merchandise, absolutely packed. Is this a huge change from earlier ships? Is it with the change in size? Is there a big change in conditions?
That we can't really know, but it definitely did impact how people viewed travel. So we hear of travelers in the Mediterranean, and they comment, we were in a ship with people who spoke Greek, and both clerics and lay people and all sorts of variety of folks. So ships were areas where kind of the high and the low would all be in it together.
Interesting kind of social mixing in those spaces. That's fascinating. I suppose something else I'd like to ask, coming from that from the story with the icon of St. Edmund, is about religion and the sea. I mean, how does the sea figure in religious thought in this period?
Well,
or at least in popular religion.
Or how does religion influence how people approach the sea? And in quite a big way. First of all, most of our sources come from religious houses, so that will color how seafaring is portrayed. But there seems no reason to doubt that given the conditions of seafaring, which must have been very scary, really, religion is what people turn to in times of need. So not only in scenarios of disaster, but also before embarking, ships would be blessed by a local priest for a safe voyage, or saints might be turned to in order to conjure up favorable winds for sailing. And also when people returned home to port, they would also usually give an offering to a saint's shrine. So a big question emerged, well, who will help us the most at sea? Which
the
saints?
most effective saints.
Yeah, so certain rivalries emerged even. Nicholas was the big one, Bishop of Myra, so he had quite a reputation as the patron saint of sailors and merchants, because his original shrine was along some trade routes in the Mediterranean. In 1087, some enterprising Normans from Bari kidnapped his remains and transported them back to Bari, establishing a new shrine there.
Oh, wow.
And in the process, some of his parts were pilfered and taken elsewhere, so then kind of shoot-up shrines were established in Normandy, but his reputation was widespread.
Yeah, almost as widespread as his remains.
Yes, well, even more so, because his fame could travel.
Yeah.
So he was very well known as a patron saint of sailors, and shrines were dedicated to him in seaports around the Anglo-Norman realm. But some English saints in particular, well, and Norman ones too, kind of reacted to this appeal, because being a patron at sea can be quite profitable. It brings pilgrims and other folks who have been saved with their offerings. So other saints' promoters seem to have argued for their own effectiveness at sea, as it were. So St. Edmund is one of these. So in this collection of miracles that includes the one about the knight Norman with his horse, that miracle ends with some telling claims about his powers at sea. And here I have a quote with that. So this writer at the end of the knight Norman's miracle says, "When the passengers were calling for St. Nicholas, a certain person appeared, saying, 'Behold, I am at hand.' Even though they were not calling him to mind, the patronage of the martyr Edmund defended them."
Amazing.
Yeah, and then so there are other than miracles that Edmund performs specifically at sea. One of them is about an abbot of Angers, which happens to be dedicated to St. Nicholas. He's trying to travel to England on business, but the winds are not in his favor. He's waiting for days and days, praying to St. Nicholas, nothing happens, and then an old monk comes up and advises for him to pray instead to St. Edmund, and then sure enough, the breezes turn, and he makes it safely. So there is a great need and a high demand for help at sea as well, through religion, and this affects the local cult centres as well.
I was aware that there were competing sainthoods, but I didn't realise it was quite so competitive.
They're very explicit. Well, sometimes it's not only competitive, they'll say, well, just like Nicholas, Cuthbert is good at sea as well. So I imagine people chose based on who their local favourite was as well.
Fascinating. I suppose because you work on this kind of Anglo-Norman axis, I wanted to hear a little bit more, because you talk about the fact that the court has to straddle the channel essentially. How does that impact on government or on seafaring? I mean, what makes that different? What comes before and what comes afterwards?
Well, it seems like the Norman kings established a very particular system of getting themselves across the channel, and also more regular shipments of treasure, particularly from England to Normandy, and also deer and household possessions. So we know this mostly from the pipe rolls of Henry II's reign, which are records of exchequery expenses, so royal expenses, and a lot of them from Southampton especially concern regular shipments of the treasury, which was based at Winchester, and these other items that I mentioned. And then the king had his own special ship called an esneka, and there might have been a couple operating at one time, but this seems to have been just a very fancy ship that was also fast and specially outfitted for
it's a touch of the Air Force One about it, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Sorry, that's a dreadful anachronism.
No, I've used that same one myself, actually, because there's one anecdote from Ralph Dicito, who was a late 12th century historian, and he wrote about Henry II's itinerary during one year. So he was first in Ireland, and then he went to, he sailed across to Wales, landed at St. David's, made his way post-haste is the word, to to port in England and then sailed across to Normandy. And this chronicler writes that when the King of France at the time heard this, he joked, well, rather than boarding a horse or a ship, Henry should have decided to fly, something to that effect. So it did require quite a lot of extensive travel, but they incorporated that into their government, and particular officials were also in charge of making this happen.
Mm-hmm. But of course, that comes with its dangers as well. And I'm thinking of this one particular disaster that you want to.
Yes, you're probably thinking of the White Shipwreck of 1120.
I am indeed.
So this demonstrated that even though they had this system of transport, it could go disastrously wrong. So this happened in 1120. King Henry I had been in Normandy, had just been victorious in some wars, and was preparing to return triumphantly to England. Now, as kings do, he was traveling with a large party of followers, including a bunch of nobility, his only legitimate son and heir, Prince William, along with 2 other illegitimate children, and perhaps hundreds of followers. So we know about this from Orderic Vitalis, who was a monk living and writing in Normandy at this time, who left a very extensive history of contemporary times. So from Orderic's tale, we learn that Henry got to port at Barfleur, and this captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, approached him saying, I have a very fine ship, splendidly outfitted for royal service. Can it be of use to you? And the king already had his ship organized, but he allowed Prince William to travel in the White Ship. Now, there seems to have been some revelry going on before they embarked. Apparently all the sailors got drunk, and they left at night, and so just shortly after leaving the harbor, they struck a rock and sank. Everyone on board died, except for one man who lived to tell the tale. He was a butcher from Rouen, and must have survived thanks to his rough pelt jacket. So this was very tragic for the families of those involved, but also led to wider political developments. Henry, the king, immediately, well, very soon, then got remarried, but did not have another child. So as a result of the death of the heir at sea, there was a disputed succession upon Henry's death in 1135. So one result of this wreck, then, is that a lot of people wrote about it at the time, so we learn more about seafaring practice from it. But it was very sad for those involved, because death at sea was a very grave concern. They weren't sure if bodies not buried in consecrated ground would be able to rise to heaven upon the resurrection. So this was very scary, and in fact later kings took a special precaution when they were sailing. So it looks like Henry II tried to sail on the feast day of St. Nicholas when he could, when the time was right. So timing voyages to be at more auspicious times.
So it must have been, obviously emotionally devastating, but also, politically, it engenders a huge crisis in the state as well, which is fascinating. So you've mentioned a great variety of sources. I think you mentioned pipe rolls, and you mentioned materials that come from monastic houses as well. So I suppose the question is, could you give us maybe an overview of the kinds of source that you use? I mean, if they present any particular difficulties or challenges, but also then how you bring them all together, because you've painted some really vibrantly sensory images of the maritime world, and how you find this kind of information and how you get sources to speak about it.
This has been one of the challenges of the PhD, and also a reason I think why maritime history is neglected for this period, because there are very few explicitly nautical sources. Instead, most of them regard land transactions and landed activities. So my approach has been rather unsophisticated in that I'm reading everything I can and pulling out the maritime bits. So the risk of that is using the sources for purposes they weren't meant to do, but I think that's the hazard of any historical project. So I'm using narrative accounts, so what we would consider histories and chronicles. The hagiographical accounts, particularly miracles, can be very colorful. And then some less colorful documentary sources for, say, charter grants, giving land tenure to a certain beneficiary would also include coastal privileges or the ability to regulate shipping. So those can give us an idea of what port life was like. Also on that, archaeology can tell us quite a great deal about ships themselves, but also port spaces. And then there are some travel accounts, I could call them that, and even one very exciting source that survives from probably the late 12th century that is actually a sort of pilotage book, going from the Humber all the way to the Holy Land with varying degrees of precision along the way. But for the coast of England, it's amazingly precise.
Just giving routes and obstacles and...
Yeah, so describing the sandbanks along the way, what you should do to avoid hitting them, which harbors are the best, and even some trading advice. Like it says, well, you should, if you buy tin in Cornwall and then bring it to Lisbon or even to the Holy Land, you'll double your price, double your money, something like that.
So canny commercial advice as well.
So there's a great variety, and that makes it more exciting to do research, is that then we get a bunch of different viewpoints. And then my job is to pull it all together and try to get a more complete picture. And actually they do inform each other. So we have, say, miracle accounts of shipwrecks happening, and the monastery kind of, I'll bring in pirates here. So a pirate ship might kidnap or might take hold of a monastic ship, and it wrecks along the coast that right by the monastery. So then they get the wreck, and it's seen as sort of retribution for the pirates. But actually, wrecking was a highly disputed privilege, and so this kind of reinforced.
So it shows up in the documentary record as well.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose now that you mention that, I do have to ask you a little bit about pirates. I mean, what is this? This is obviously a danger that faces people who travel by sea. What is 12th century piracy like?
Well, it's very scary for any normal travelers. Let's just say that. So pirates could take different forms. They could be ships sponsored by a rival. Say if the Counts of Flanders were in dispute or with the English king, then both sides might send out pirates.
So more like mercenaries in that sense. Paying
or they're compensated in the form of the goods that they capture. They also called Viking raiders pirates at this time. So basically anyone who was raiding by sea. But from the accounts we know of, there's one I'm thinking of where, there were some canons from Lyon Cathedral, and that their cathedral had burned down. So they decided to take the relics of St. Mary, which they had on tour in England. So they're sailing across the sea, and they get space on a merchant vessel. And the merchants have with them some, I think it's 300 marks of silver, which is a lot of money at that time, and they plan to buy wool in England. But a pirate ship is approaching their vessel, and the way it's described, it has these kind of gleaming shields and swords, and it's very scary, and it's coming up, but then they pray to the Virgin Mary, and a gust of wind blows it off course. So that's just retribution for the pirates. But so they're seen as kind of the worst offenders that there can be. But we get nothing, of course, from the pirates' viewpoint.
Their point of view.
Yes.
Sad that nothing survives. But this is just a side question, so I don't know if there's much to say on it. But I thought I'd just ask, given that you mentioned archaeological remains earlier on, are there any? Because I know that you have in Scandinavia there are Viking ships remaining from an earlier period. Do we have any surviving examples of the kinds of ships or elements of those ships that you're talking about?
We don't have any in the North Sea from the 12th century, at least that I know of. There could be some excavated that are not yet published, because that's part of the backlog. I understand there are lots of finds, but not as many published. But some of the Viking ships at Roskilde date to the 11th century. So there's one chronologically dated to around 1060 from Ireland. So this was one of those ships that were going around. Incidentally, if anyone listening has the funds to sponsor an expedition to Barfleur to search for the wreck of the White Ship, there are various accounts about whether it washed ashore or not. Some say it didn't. So it might still be there if anyone wanted to take up that task.
I'm pretty sure we can find ourselves a willing investor somewhere down the line, and obviously the PhDcasts crew will have to go along and report live from the scene.
Naturally, yes.
As we make probably the most important historical discovery of the century.
It will be very exciting because it was a royally outfitted ship carrying treasure.
So we have here, I mean, you've mentioned there's an Irish ship showing up in Roskilde. There are English ships, thinking going to Lisbon, and even maybe as far as the Holy Lands. The impression that I get is one of the Anglo-Norman realm that, you know, that is connected through the sea to a much wider world than maybe we normally imagine. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, that's true. What you say is I think that the sea was this connecting feature, despite the possibility of wreck and pirates. Mm-hmm. Overall, people continued to sail despite these dangers for profit and for travel and for broadening their horizons, I think. And this shows up in some of the stories that we get, say, from that expedition to Lisbon mm-hmm. that I may have mentioned. So this was a fleet of well over 100 ships, composed of ships from eastern England, so Norfolk and Suffolk, south of England, as well as the Low Countries and some German ones. So they were all in this fleet together to go on crusade. But we hear of it from an account of a cleric who seems to have accompanied them and wrote a letter back to a pal in Suffolk. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, East Anglia especially was a fishing center, mm-hmm. so that's where a lot of the herring fishery was based. And so at one point in his letter back, this cleric writes about the fish that they encounter in the waters of the Atlantic. So they're participating in these other worlds through their nautical adventures. And so at one point they found an electric eel, and it was said to benumb the hands of him who holds it, and it resembles a ray and has two spiky dorsal fins. So he's actually describing the fauna of these faraway waters. Similarly, Roger of Howden was a royal administrator who accompanied Richard the Lionheart on crusade, and they encountered flying fish in the Mediterranean and were quite astonished at this. So he wrote, "These fish are like cuttlefish, which, leaving the sea, fly through the air, and after they have flown about a furlong, descend again into the sea. Someone who saw this testified to it, and what he said was true, for when he was sitting at table on the high ship, one of these flying fish fell in front of him on the table." So this was a sort of medieval ready meal, but they're commenting on it and being aware of these differences. And I also mentioned that people would find themselves stuck on board with people of other nationalities speaking different languages and praying to different saints even. Mm-hmm. And they took this into consideration. So there's one great story about a certain man called Guimond, who was prior of St. Fridesweeds in Oxford. Mm-hmm. And he was sailing en route to Jaffa on pilgrimage. A storm came upon the ship, and he urged his storm-tossed comrades to call upon the Blessed Virgin Mary to save them, reasoning that St. Nicholas would only understand Greek. So so they really took this into account when they were sailing. Yeah.
That's fabulous. And I suppose then, as well as people going out and seeing the world, you also have, with trade, with metals and coins, you have the world coming back to the Anglo-Norman realm as well.
So in port records, again in these pipe rolls, we have accounts of royal purchases of items in the major ports of the realm, which is where kind of luxury international traffic was channeled. And this was partly because they had the best docking facilities and also the best regulations to protect foreign merchants. So this is where you see purchases of items from Byzantium and the Empire and the rest of the Mediterranean world.
So in looking at maritime culture in the Anglo-Norman realm, this idea comes out, I think, from your research of the sea and the land as being much more integrated, not being two entirely separate bodies. To what extent does this respond to a tradition in the historiography? I mean, are you responding to earlier trends that you think are maybe mistaken or misguided? Or
Well, I'm more informed by other historiographies, namely maritime history. Obviously, this is a big field that has very much informed my research. So from Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the age of Philip II, seeing land and sea as connected and informing each other. And this has been a kind of burgeoning field at Cambridge as well. We have a maritime history workshop, and reading these sorts of materials and talking with others in the field has helped a great deal. My research is also informed by the Williams Mystic program in Maritime Studies, which I participated in as an undergraduate, which follows this approach of looking at the sea from various different angles and then using each to inform the other. So I'm really just applying that to Anglo-Norman history, which, as I said, tends to have the view from the landed perspective.
So one thing I like to ask here, just to finish up, is what happens next? So in the time remaining in your research, or maybe in a next project, what else would you like to do or like to find? Or are there questions raised by this that you'll hope to move on to in a future project?
Well, actually, I'm still hoping that other researchers, particularly in the medieval world, but also in the fields of maritime history, will help me out if they come across scenarios about maritime elements of particularly the Anglo-Norman realm. They might pass those on to me, because as I mentioned, I'm just trying to read everything I can, but one person can't do that. So I'm gaining a lot from colleagues who are tipping me off about different points to follow up on, and then amassing all this data will help to paint a bigger picture. And then eventually I hope that just maritime history will be incorporated more generally into Anglo-Norman history as part of it, not just a focused topic.
And that would seem to be the kind of thing that you're moving towards in the PhD as well, to say that we can't think of a maritime history that's just about the sea, that it's got to be intertwined.
Yes.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at CRASSH, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.